at ya, mad at ya. Tell you what's master, coming at ya, coming at ya. Rhyme style disaster, coming at ya, mad at ya. Tell you what's master, coming at ya.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-host Wilfred Riley, and we are joined by Brooks Crenshaw. He is a writer and a speaker and a thinker, and it's great to have you on, Brooks.
Thanks, Charles. Good to see you.
So I think we are going to get into a lot of things, both political, economics, talk a little bit about some of the global foreign policy issues that have been kind of in the news lately. But I guess we should start with something, I guess a more macro view of what's going on, since you write a lot about philosophy and talk about, man and what is natural, because a lot of the things that we are having these debates over and the things that what I think many people with too much hubris think they can fix it goes back to that. So we're trying to fix things in a way that we probably can't fix, or we're looking at the problems on too granular a level. So I want to get your thoughts on that as you think about the shock to the system of Trump coming in at 2.0, saying he's gonna, you know, improve on, get all the things done that he didn't get done the first time. And his opponents haven't really changed their, at least yet, their method of attack. So how do you tie all of that into the existential, the philosophical, and human nature?
Well, human nature, I would say where we are right now with the Trump administration, we're like 50 some odd days in. He gave a killer speech the other night. I think we all feel really good about where we are. But I would compare that to it's as if we've gotten the first round of antibiotics. And as any doctor will tell you, if you don't finish the treatment, the infection is going to come back stronger and kill you. And so in terms of at the philosophical level, we could talk about man's hubris and the adversarial spirit, the Luciferian spirit that wants to make reality in his own image and a utopian vision rather than to align with reality as it is. But at the level that I'm engaging with here, with regard to how we feel about post-Trump, I think an administration built solely on executive order is temporary, and without congressional action, this is wonderful first round of antibiotics that ultimately will dissolve overnight once the pen and phone end up with a Newsom or a Buttigieg or whomever.
Mm-hmm.
So, the founders got this right with regard to separation of powers. The question is, can the power that is needed enact what is necessary to lock some of this in? Because essentially we've swung back and forth so many times left to right, but what's actually happened is the power has stacked, every time, whether you're talking about a swing from New Deal or Great Society leftism to Patriot Act era security state to COVID response. Every time it's just grown the federal state. And until that is addressed, and to include the federal code, this ends with Stalin's "show me the man and I will show you the crime."
Wow. So Will, there was everything. It's like with every phrase, I had another, avenue I wanted to go down, and I think we're going to do that. But I want to do them in order. So I want to go back, ironically, to not even the deep stuff he said. The first thing where he talked about the feelings.
Sure.
That is odd. I personally didn't watch the speech. Obviously, you get so many people talking about it. You see some clips, you kind of get the tenor of what happened. But he mentioned talking about feeling prior to and analogous to the antibiotic, the first wave. But he said that people are starting to feel a little bit better based on where we were coming from with Biden. But even that is interesting, right? We're still in this fog of it's lifting a little, but the fog of the media telling you one narrative where reality is the polar opposite. So I see that they did the polls, like 70 something percent of people agreed, thought the speech was either good or very good, right? Most people are like, yeah, I agree with what he says. But you're hearing that, but if you watch the media, you listen to certain outlets, it was bad and it was dark and all these other things. So aren't we still at the point where he's right about what most normal people think, but the media hasn't caught up or they don't want to catch up, and they're still acting like everyone's afraid. They're still trying to tell you to be afraid when no one's really afraid anymore. It's a weird phenomenon.
Well, I think that the media for a long time has been kind of the creator of knowledge, which is a really weird thing. Like I remember when Mitt Romney was running for president, I kind of like we all have a business background. And I kind of liked Mitt Romney. Like I thought he was boring, but like if I was going to vote Republican that year, I wouldn't have had a problem with him. I thought he gave good speeches, and every time he'd give just an average B plus speech, the media would rip it to pieces. Like another white man, Mitt Romney, went out there and said some banal bullshit, and they'd give like a B plus speech a C minus. And I think that for a long time, we've been used in the American upper middle class to them kind of doing that, right? It's like Walter Cronkite, like, I'm the man you can trust. This is the news you can believe.
Hmm.
And I think with Trump, they're still doing that. Like their read on Trump is he's evil. There's certain things like he's a big charismatic guy. They'll acknowledge that, but he wants to be a dictator.
Right.
He has to be watched really closely, or he's going to take over the country. And a lot of it's just completely fake. I mean, Trump's only got probably 6 or 7 more years to live. He's not running again. Biden was much more inclined to use almost tyrannical techniques than Trump was. So, they're running with a narrative. It's not necessarily real. I think the issue though is most people don't believe it anymore. So like when you look at these polls after, there's the day after Trump speaks, 70% positive. Then after 2 days of media coverage, it's still 68% positive. You don't see the effect you used to. What you're seeing is instead declining trust in the media, where now 12% of Republicans and 40% of independents say they trust the media at all. Everyone else doesn't. I mean, I think that's really this kind of staggering elephant in the room. As with Trump himself, I mean, it's kind of what both you guys said, or what Brooks in particular said. Just, he can come in, he can do almost anything, but a lot of it's just going to be symbolic, like the Gulf of America type stuff, unless you can really pull back the debt, unless you can really get Congress to do something. Like, I'd be curious about when the last time a government agency was gotten rid of. Was that the time Clinton and Gingrich shook hands and did it? I mean, it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And since then, we've just seen like the government get larger and larger and larger.
Yeah, 300,000 federal government workers were reduced during Contract of America, but that was over 4 years. And Trump looks to be doing that possibly in the first couple months.
If they let him.
Right.
If they don't tell everybody to come back to work, maybe. And I guess that's the next really important place to go. I just wanted to point that out. But more importantly, is you touched on something, Brooks, that I talk about on the regular basis, and people are starting to talk about it now, but there was a while I would say that this is a problem. Now, I agree that executive orders is not the way to fix it, but and people, I guess it's a good thing that people are starting to notice it. But what I think that we have been lacking for decades is an understanding. One, we're not really teaching people the Constitution and civics and the history of the country. So understanding that everybody talks about separation of powers and what the three branches do, but they don't really understand the nuances of the limit, what limited government means, and what you're supposed to be trying to do is like a doctor doing no harm, covering the things that are part of your role, with the least size of the government that you can do. And we've been away from that for a while. But beyond that, because we got so partisan, people would cheer for their guy. So if their guy takes too much power, but he's doing things I like, we stay quiet, forgetting that the next guy, now you just gave the next guy those same powers, and then it becomes these layers, so the government never gets smaller. And it's evidenced by the fact that I haven't looked at one in a while since COVID and since Trump, because Trump kind of broke things. But you used to look at national polls ranking presidents, like the best presidents of all time, right? And hovering around the top, take Washington out the list because he's the OG, right? As I look at Thomas Sowell in the background.
Yes.
When you look at all the other presidents, they were all people who, for good or bad, whether he was your guy or not, kind of, stretched the role of the presidency, right? It's like you don't see Calvin Coolidge up there. You don't see, you don't see anybody who is just kind of like, I'm trying to maybe it's not many you can put on the list, but you don't see, even like, what's the guy? You don't see Hoover. You don't see anybody. I mean, there's lots of reasons for that, but I mean, it's always FDR, Woodrow Wilson, and the people who wanted to pack the court or confiscate things or the Sedition Act.
They were leading, Charles. They were leading.
Right. And so, and then you layer that on to the piece that while Trump is being, it's like a blitzkrieg, but while he's being really, shock and awe about attacking it, the last thing I'll say is that no one ever said anything about the unelected bureaucrat. Now it sounds crazy because anything Trump says, it sounds crazy. But it is. I mean, I talked about it a little bit before then, but the time it really struck me was the Affordable Care Act. Remember, because it became news because Nancy Pelosi said we got to pass it. We got to pass it first, and then you can read it. So then it was on the internet, and everybody was reading it. And so I didn't read the whole thing. It was what, 1,000 pages or whatever. But as I scrolled through it, the thing that got me was like, well, every paragraph it started with the secretary will, right? The secretary will dictate this. The secretary will decide that. And it's like, okay, so you got all these people lifelong, government officials, and I'm sure some of them work hard, do a great job. They're not corrupt, whatever, but they have too much power already. And then Congress abdicated their responsibility. So they'll pass a law and then say, okay, we get to write legislation, but we're going to pass the law and then we're just going to give it to someone else to work out what it means, right? Not just to enforce it, that's not their job, but somebody else will decide what it means by, you must do this or you cannot do this. And no one paid attention to that. And so that was just a toxic mix of government overreach. And that's kind of how we got here now. So I say all that to say, I guess, Brooks, do you think people are slowly starting to realize that, or not even are they, but are they doing it enough? Or is it just, when it's not my guy? So like the Democrats are noticing it because Trump's in power, and the conservatives kind of, and the Republicans noticed it when Biden was in power. But unless it affects them directly, they just kind of go on with their lives and don't care.
Yeah, I think that, there are more people aware. It's interesting to watch Elon Musk's progression, right? Like he kind of was a guy of the left, and suddenly he discovers von Mises and Austrian economics. And, I think his progression over the last, say, 2 to 5 years has been something that I think that will convert more people to being more economically aware and more civically aware with regard to the role of the federal government in a federalist system.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about unelected bureaucrats making law, one of the issues that is close to me is, when the ATF writes an opinion paper that makes a component that was completely legal yesterday into a felony with a 5-year minimum. Those are moves that the average person doesn't really realize, A, that it's taking place, and B, how capricious it is at the bureaucratic level. I wrote an article about this for the Daily Caller entitled How Prohibition Creates 90 Million Felons Today. And it's really just because of alcohol prohibition, you stifled supply, demand grew, a black market emerged to fill the demand, and with that black market came crime and enforcement. And so the FBI, had to crack down on these gangsters that are running booze and running their Tommy guns. And so the NFA, the National Firearms Act, was crafted, and it banned a lot of otherwise acceptable, arms. And that is the instrument through which the ATF then made the pistol brace illegal, which I believe there's between 20 and 40 million in circulation. So, you would have tens of millions of felons the day that rule is finalized, based on the fact that government intruded into the market. Crime rose as a result. Government proposed a solution to the problem that was a secondary problem to the problem it created in the first place. Mm-hmm. And that's always the That's always the loop, right? The camel gets the nose into the tent and there are problems. And it's like, well, more government will solve the problems. Don't pay attention to where the problems came from. And so, yeah, the unelected bureaucrat is writing law in a manner that is untenable. Yeah, for sure.
Right. But to that, Will,
Mhm.
I think we all agree on that. And there's some ways you can kind of stifle and bring it back a little bit. But in this day and age, as far as we've gone, as big as it's gotten, the government overall, as much power as they've given to the executive, and as dumb as they've made us Americans, somewhat intentionally, especially when it comes civically of learning about the government. Can we go back to what did Elon want to go back to? Like the 5 departments, the first, original 8 departments or something. What do you want to go back? Can we really do that?
Oh, yeah, we could do it tomorrow. I mean, so I'll give you, and I'm like, we've all been bosses, but I'll give you an example of how this works. Like, so right now, I'm not going to name any names or any of the agencies we're applying to, but right now I'm doing my faculty accreditation at Kentucky State. And the entire thing is that we are compiling all these credentials and we're sending these credentials to a department of our institution that sends these credentials to a credentialing agency. And the credentialing agency exists to get credentials from a bunch of institutions and say, hey, these look okay. So I'm taking my book and I'm getting a letter from my editor saying, yes, he wrote this book. He's not pretending. And they're taking a picture of the book in like the office of HarperCollins or whatever. Like I'm doing all this a little more seriously than maybe I need to be. And they're going to send this packet to the group that says that, good first and second tier universities that aren't Ivy League in the upper South can continue to exist. And I think the reality is like if you got rid of that agency, Kentucky State, the University of Kentucky and Northern Kentucky and so on would just continue offering classes in Kentucky, like nothing would change. There's a free market, right? So if students didn't want to go there, if it turned out the professors couldn't read, people just would stop giving us money. Like, I mean, none of us are making up the books we've written. So it's just the whole thing. There's this external agency that exists simply to say that the people in this building are who we say we are. And so we then have, I don't know, we're a smaller college, but 10 people that exist to interact with, and they do a great job. I'm not insulting these colleagues, but to interface with this external agency. And it sounds like I'm making this up, and I'm probably exaggerating it a little bit, one of my very few weaknesses. But this is something that goes on in every bureaucratic agency. And everyone's interacted with bureaucracies in this way. So, I mean, this is the Department of Education, right, at a larger level. So when people talk about the Department of Education, whenever I say Trump wants to get rid of this to my students, their initial reaction, and I'm not going to try to do the Southern or the Appalachian accent, but it's sort of like, what? He's going to get rid of the schools? And it's like, no, the Department of Education doesn't run the schools. Well, what the hell does it do? And that's when you get into the Department of Education, they're the people that put the ethnic studies curriculum and the LGBT curriculum and the standardized tests and so on in the schools. And at this point, the kids, especially the males, start getting a little irritated. Like, you mean all that garbage we had to do? You mean like all that gay communism? And it's like, yep, that's the gay communism agency. Like those are the boys that are responsible for that. You had to leave class once every 2 weeks and take that lesson on, whatever, black people or the first Scots Irishmen to come into the high hills here in Kentucky or whatever. But I mean, so like if you remove that agency and you had to learn about black people or Irishmen from your father, would that affect you in any way? I don't think so. But there's a final point here that I do want to make, because I mean, I think that one's been made like a minute or two ago, actually. The real issue would be the social issue of getting rid of like all the emperor's eunuchs, right? Like by this point, where like I read recently that 65% of all black women with executive jobs, and by the way, it's like 42% of all white women with executive jobs work for the government. So there's this massive infrastructure that's been created for like upper middle class women. That's the main group. Like black men mostly own construction businesses, that kind of thing, but minorities to some extent, whole fields, social work, like all those things exist only insofar as there's a government for them to exist within. So if you just get rid of the government, what happens? Like if you were to cut some of the child welfare agencies and just say, what we're going to do is give money to law enforcement to really brutalize parents that abuse their kids. And this would work quite well. If you look at what Latin America does, I've lived there. Okay, fine. You have less abused kids, but what do you do with those 500,000 people. They just go work in stores. I think
Learn the
that would be the
code.
issue. I think that's where you see the marches, you see the protests, all that kind of thing.
um, I wanted to say something about the second part, but I got to, since
65% of black women,
that,
Charles.
yes, but
This is the black upper middle class for women. Are they going to have to get married and listen to a guy?
Wilfred Riley said that, not Charles. Send all your letters to
it's the
Wilfred
same for the
Riley.
white chicks. Like most liberal women have these jobs, like HR manager, and they don't exist without this bureaucracy. Like there's not an independent market need for them. It's horrible to put it that way, but it's real.
Now, but we got to get to that, Brooks. There's something there. But to the DOE thing, I got to say this because the education is my thing. Trump is talking about getting rid of it now. It's even better than what Will was giving them too much grace because they don't even write the gay communist curriculum. They just dangle the carrot to make you want to do it. They'll say, "We'll give you some money," right? They're like, they're not even doing, they're too lazy to even do the work. Because I saw some article, I wish I'd had time to read it today. It said Trump wants to get rid of the DOE. What does it mean? What do they do? And I guarantee you the article was going to wax poetic about all the wonderful things that they do. People don't trust me. Go look it up. Go Wikipedia. Go look at the original history. Go to the DOE's actual website. No conservative. You don't need to go to Fox anywhere. They do not, as Will said, they do not write curriculum. They do not build schools. They do not run schools. They do not hire principals. I give people a list all the time. This comes up when people ask this question of things they don't do. And like honest, logical people, then they look to cock their head to the side and say, well, Charles, what do they do? I'm glad you asked. They do the nation's report card, which you can get one of Elon's bright IT people to run a Power BI presentation because the data doesn't come from them. The data comes from the state. So someone's compiling the data and making it look fancy. That's all they're doing. The data comes from the states. So they do the nation's report card, which they don't do again because it comes from the states. They just compile it. They handle the civil rights violations, like if you mistreat someone, which is really important, but we have a department for that already. So we don't need that. Check. And they manage the finances, the grants, the funding for colleges, Pell Grants and all that. We got a department that handles finances. Just move that over there and get rid of everything else. No schools will close because no one opens schools. And oh, by the way, for those people who say, yes, but federal funds do go to the states. You know how much it is? Now, it varies by state, but I think New York, second largest dollar amount per pupil, largest city in the country. COVID changed the numbers a little bit, so it went up. But on average, before COVID, they got 7% from federal government. So 93% of the funding, and they love taxes in these liberal cities. Just raise the taxes a little bit and you cover that gap, which, oh, by the way, is also the reason why Trump's phone and pen and hammer and stick won't necessarily work. Like one clip I said, I just rolled my eyes about Trump. I'm sure the speech was great, but he said something, we got this terrible ideology of CRT, etc., out of education. I'm like, no, you didn't, because the education's at the state level. You did nothing. Now you might say, well, we're going to take your money. But even with Harvard and all them, they love the money. They want the money. They got these billions of dollars that they don't want to spend, but they have it. So it's hard to root it out because other than the money, they have no other control. People forget when Obama was in office and all the bathroom issue was coming up and the NCAA tournament was in North Carolina. Remember, North Carolina said that they weren't going to comply to the bathrooms. Men and women had to go to separate bathrooms. And all he said was, well, I'm going to take your funding away, because that's all he could do. That's what I want to say about that. So they don't do anything. So you're getting rid of Department of Education. Schools don't go anywhere because that's not what they do. And lastly, Brooks, I want you to get in there. But to your piece about the women in the bureaucrats, it's funny because I spoke to a large company's high-level executive who's a friend of mine who talked about, you remember last week when Elon and Trump were trying to fire these people and the judge was getting involved, said it's so unfair. See, some of these people even voted for Trump. But it's not about whether they voted for Trump. It's about whether it's waste or not in some of these jobs. Look. And he just said pretty matter-of-factly to me, it's like, they're just experiencing what happens in the real world. I work for a major corporation. This happens all the time. Like you literally go to your weekly Tuesday meeting and you're like, well, where's Craig? Oh, they laid Craig off last week. And, okay, then so who's doing this job? And you move on. It's just normal part of life. Restaurants downsize. Every private business does this. But when the federal government, as Wilford Riley said, not Charles, Wilford Riley, so as all the black women, as their jobs get threatened, then it becomes an existential crisis. So I get off my high horse on that. But Brooke, do you think that we will be? I get so Will kind of answered the technicality and the management level how you do it, but he's right about the social aspect. Can you do it in this climate? Was really the question. Like, yeah, you can do it, but can you do it? You can do it, but can you do it? I don't know if there's enough one understanding of just what it's done. There's enough framing that it's evil or it's racist or it's anti-woman or it's whatever, and it's hurting the middle class. Of that kind of framing of it, and then just people who don't know what these jobs are. People can understand. We spent $30 million to, the Middle East to test, whether toilets flush and the water comes back up green. People are like, yeah, that's crazy. But when you say you're going to cut a department or cut a level of positions, people are like, well, those are jobs of hardworking people. You can't cut them. And even if you really don't need them, they can't wrap their mind around it. So that's what I mean. Can you do it? What do you say to that?
So there's a saying that when you're gambling at pool or at cards, and you're down a lot and you want to go double or nothing, the guy on the other side of the table says, no, no, you got to get better the way you got sick. Um, I would say that the administrative bloat on, all three columns, government, university, government education, and business, has been building for a long time. I mean, so in the government, I would say that it got kicked into high gear in the Woodrow Wilson administration and later in the FDR administration. So that's been going for some time. The administrative bloat in the universities is certainly in part due to the long march through the institutions in the early 70s and beyond. And these administrations act like tumors on their organizations because they become self-licking ice cream cones that are there for servicing their own existence and not necessarily the product or service that is offered as part of their mission. We used to joke in business, they used to joke that when the neo-Marxist college graduate comes into the business space, it's like, yeah, let him spend a couple years in the market. He'll figure out that his utopian vision just doesn't work. And that worked for a time, but then we hit this critical mass where, I would submit that the percentage of women that Wilfred laid out earlier, it is a shame that through their education and training, they were converted into cancer cells. I mean, that's effectively what I would say is these administrations are tumors, and in that comes in the form in the business world of the HR bloat and the DEI officer, et cetera, the commissar system within the corporate structure. And so, yeah, I think that undoing that overnight is probably untenable. So that's going to require a citizenry that's more engaged. And the block there is government schools have been working against the ideal of a classical education meant to provide its graduates with enough of an education so that they are part of a more well-read and well-informed electorate so they can elect better representation. And teachers unions, they unions make what serves them, and teachers unions make 18-year-old voters. Like that's what they produce. And so there is an incentive structure there to produce civically and financially illiterate students. And that's where we are. I don't think a Trump administration of executive orders can undo that.
Right. Yeah, I don't think so either. I think that not only are they not teaching them civics, they're deliberately teaching them. Like I hear in my kids' elementary school lessons about them. And they're nuanced. It's not gender and all that. It's um, being activists, right? A call to action. And so I just asked, why exactly is an 8-year-old acting on any social issue, whether I agree with it or not? I mean, why are we
Why were
putting
there Hitler Youth? Why were there red? Why was the Red Army made of kids? Like,
Right.
that's why.
Yeah, but speaking of you mentioned DEI. I know we all understand its harms, and again, Trump is attacking that too. And I know that I think you posted something recently about the neo-Marxists and what Lindsay and Rufo and others have been talking about, and like you talked about the march to the academy, which is definitely the case. But what are your thoughts, both of you, in fact, on the idea? So I have this premise, kind of like all that stuff is true, and it's that, but I also believe that, for instance, I would say that radicals have always been with us, right? There's always been communists, have always been, people with very sexual proclivities, or, people who hated the country, or whatever the case may be. I think what our biggest change in the last decade or so has been, you know, the number of people and the people in different positions who started to tolerate it. One of my friends asked me earlier today why the left doesn't realize that average citizens are not buying into the trans thing, or whatever. I said, because most of them aren't saying anything about it, right? So they don't realize that them being quiet about it long enough doesn't matter, that they're on the right side of it. Those people who are radicals are pushing their agenda through. They get the least, as the resistance kind of declines and they have no resistance, they don't stop. They kind of move ahead and they shift and they ask for, well, we were asked for this crazy thing. We never thought we were going to get it, but then we got it. So what do we do now? I don't know. Just ask for some more stuff. And so they just keep going. So it's kind of like the this push has kind of always been there, not exactly at the same level and in the same way, but it's been there. But we've gotten to a point in society where we have this suffocating empathy, right? So it's just like we have to feel bad about everything and everyone all the time. Will and I had a guest on last week. Really great interview. It was Dean Phillips, who primaried Biden in the election last year, and he's a Democrat and a liberal who's having some serious problems with that side of the political aisle, to his credit. And so he brought up the fact that the Democrats lost a lot of people with the trans issue. They were just wrong on it, and he couldn't understand why they decided to die on that hill. And then Will said that, something to the effect that, it's also a problem when you're being forced to agree with someone's mental illness. And he had to push back and say, well, I got to stop you there. I got to push back on that. And so they came in this back and forth. Will logically thought he was saying that it was okay. I'm like, no, he said, I don't know if this is worse or better, but he's not saying you're wrong, Will, that transgenderism and the way it's being pushed is a problem. No, he's taking an issue with the terminology you're using.
Yeah, it was a really interesting glance into the liberal mind, actually, because like Dean and I totally agreed. I actually had a brief exchange with him on social media about this. Like, he just didn't think you should call crazy people crazy. And I think that really sums up a lot of what you're dealing with here. And it's actually really hard to communicate that way. I don't know. I mean, I basically think empathy outside of your house is bad. Like, social policy should be based on, if not pure amoral logic, the greatest good for the greatest number. Like John Stuart Mill described that as, in fact, being the Christian position, 159 years ago or something like that. So if you want to help people, you have to think of, as cold as it might seem, what's the value of a human to you, or what's the value to you of helping a certain person do a certain thing, and then what's the thing that will benefit the most people in the greatest way. So like, does it help more people to have junkies sleeping in the middle of the street, intimidating business women, and in fact harming themselves, frostbite, gangrene, and so on? Or would it benefit society and even those people more to move them to some kind of controlled setting? And we right now seem to have the kind of empathy that little kids do, where the idea is like it would be initially mean to do that thing to those people, so we can't do it. Like there's not really a lot more to the analysis beyond that. Like if you just say, well, obviously, like more people would be hurt if you let a rapist sleep in the middle of a park downtown for a year and he were to come in contact with 1,000 people than if you didn't. Like no one's really responding to that logically. They're just saying things like, I don't like it that you're calling him a crazy rapist. Could you use some other term for him? How could we have failed him? It's like all these questions that come from the side that don't address the basic question. This is actually kind of a rambly, but a good point. Like all these questions don't address the basic question of, do you let the guy who at this point is a crazy rapist sleep in the park or not? Like, do you let the guy who has a penis and who is very sexually attracted to women after 2 years in jail go to the women's prison or not? Those are the only options. And I mean, the answer obviously is no, because it makes no sense. The harm outweighs the benefit. Like we all learned how to think like this when we were 7.
Right. And see, Brooks, I want to get your thoughts on that. Like, is that part of the problem? I mean, DEI has been around. There's all this, there's definitely people intentional about that. But at the same time, this what I mean by this empathy, I'm not as smart as Will. So I use a much simpler analogy. I used to joke that people would ask me, so where do you think this all started? And I would just say, clearly, it started with Seinfeld. And they say, what do you mean? I said, it started with the episode of Seinfeld when a character thought that George and Jerry were gay. And they were like, oh, no, we're not gay. And then they threw their hands up and said, not that there's anything wrong with it. The moment we got shame out of this situation, the moment we stopped just being, as Will says, sometimes you just got to say things that are true. And the moment we got to that, it was a subtle thing, but it started to emerge. Before we got to just, you can't call a person homeless, they're unhoused. But it was little things. Well, you got to consider what they're thinking. No, we don't. He was bad like him up. Well, what about what his mother thought? And then it got to the point a couple of years ago. I had a young liberal woman, totally caring, totally serious, saying to me, "We're talking about, let's say a guy." I gave her a hypothetical situation. Guy comes in, robs a liquor store. The cashier gives him the money. He shoots him anyway. Cashier dies. He's leaving. On the way out the door, he hears a sound and notices that someone's in the back of the store crouching and hiding. He could have got away, went back and shot him anyway. Just a vicious crime. Now, he's young, he's black, he had a tough background. And that all comes out when he's arrested. They find him. But then you also find out that the cashier it was a child from a single mom, the first person in their family to go to college, working while going through college, had a small scholarship, but needed more money to send back home to the younger siblings. And in fact, picked up the shift because they needed more money. That wasn't even their shift. And I asked this person a simple question. I don't mind. I'm nicer than Will. I don't mind that you have empathy for the poor shooter because he had a rough life. I just want to know why the first thought in your mind is to the shooter and not that person who was the cashier or the person that was in the store and anyone else. You instantly think, well, before we put him in jail, we got to see if his mom gave him 3 hots, every night, that kind of deal. And to that, just the other day, I'll end on this. Boston's mayor came out after a guy was being crazy. I don't think he killed anybody, but he was threatening people with a weapon. Off-duty police officer shot and killed him. And she's like, a brave cop, blah, blah, blah. And then before we go on, I want to, have a moment of silence and send my thoughts and prayers to the person who lost their life today. You mean the potential would-be murderer. But they have to think about that. So isn't that, if not an equal part of the problem, Brooks, isn't that accelerating what those who are intentional about this stuff are doing, because we got all these overly empathetic fools?
Yeah. When you talk about empathy, and Will and I had this conversation in the gym recently about that 2x2 chart that demonstrates, how empathy has traveled from the center of the household to, the general living beings and the general universe.
Oh, yeah.
And, that there's something to that. What Will was talking about earlier, I want to pick at that, not pick against it, but to add to it, that doesn't even take into account the role of the state versus the role of the individual. Right. Mm-hmm. And so I write about this a lot. Like we're built on the West, and the US in general is built on a series of stacked values or frameworks. And you had to go through these sequences to go from one mode of being to the next. And so, we're built on Greco-Roman philosophy, the biblical, the Judeo-Christian ethic, Magna Carta, British common law, Scottish Enlightenment, and those things stack. And in the biblical narrative, one of the key values that was provided, that was required, is there's neither Jew nor Greek nor bond nor free, which essentially reduces it takes away the tribal affiliation and looks at the individual as the single unit of value. The other one is render unto Caesar what Caesar, and unto God what's God's. The problem today is there are a lot of Christian women that want to play Jesus with the Roman treasury. And so like that's a different thing. If you want to be kind to the poor, and you want to be kind to the young man who may or may not kill and rape and kill you, or in whichever order he prefers, that's not necessarily what the state is required to do. The state is supposed to make law and enforce it. And the state that governs least governs best within the 18 enumerated powers, or whatever, is the limitation of the framework of the state itself. But like, its key role is the protection of individual liberty, and that means protecting the woman from the rapist.
Right.
And I would say, and we've seen the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians get captured by the neo-Marxist, and they're full woke now. And they are essentially, like I said, playing Jesus with the Roman treasury. And not only that, they have what I would call Barabbas syndrome, right? It's like they are the ones that say, give us Barabbas, right? And like there's a reason why that crowd did that, and it's the same reason that it's happening now. It's a series of entrenched corruption over time. That's what happens. Is my mic still working? Okay.
Yep.
Sorry, my headphones.
It sounds like I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, my headphones ducked out for a second. Sorry. So yeah, we often conflate or don't dissect the question of, is this for the state to do or for the individual? And I think individuals with empathy are, that's fine depending on how deep their empathy goes. But the state has no, to quote, was it Adam Smith? Who was it? What's the quote? It's punishment to the innocent, or cruelty to the innocent.
Yeah. Kindness to the guilty is cruelty to the innocent.
Cruelty to the innocent. Yeah, exactly. And so like that's a set of guardrails that has to be navigated properly. You can't just feel for the criminal because you're being cruel to the non-criminal.
Right. Yeah, I just think it's a new law. I mean, it's a progression, of course, but it just seems like this, that it came upon us. Obviously, it didn't. That it came upon us all of a sudden. Like all of a sudden, that was what was important. All of a sudden, these people are marginalized. But they don't tend to ask the people if they think they're marginalized. They just say, we think the people are marginalized, so they're marginalized. So we're going to talk about them being marginalized, which doesn't help them no longer be marginalized, even if they are marginalized, because you keep reminding them and reinforcing the fact that they're marginalized. So even that, when we're not talking about violent criminals, the logic that the way they frame history and the way we interact with one another, the levels of racism, everything is, a house of cards. Is everything is built on lies. But I guess they figure if you repeat it enough, it becomes true. What about let me see, we talked about the DEI thing he's doing, the deep state, as it were. What about our foreign policy? Any thoughts on, in general, on Ukraine, on any of that? What do you think is on the horizon from that respect?
I like Trump's foreign policy. He seems to harken back. I think Trump has a crush on the 80s, and just really like that's the reason why I'm proud to be an American, Lee Greenwood and YMCA, late 70s. Like I think he yearns for that time in American history, because that's where a lot of things were leveling out. And these things aren't rifle shots, they're 40 millimeter grenade launchers. And so like when you're at the right place, it still takes some time for progression to be made within the system when it's just right. And if you go too far, you don't even realize you've gone too far. And so I think Trump is hearkening back to kind of the peace through strength, Reagan, small campaigns if necessary, but no big wars. I think that he is I think that he's correct in that Ukraine wouldn't have happened had he been in office. I think that's a reasonable assumption. I think that his efforts to stop the war are right. I mean, I don't think Putin's going to go any further. I think Putin wants. I think if the Donbass and Crimea gets formalized, I think he'll be happy to take his toys and go home. I think the stoking of the war machine is largely the same people who've always wanted us to get in. Yellow cake, don't drop that shit in here. Those kind of saber rattlers. And look, I spent 10 years in both campaigns, and I don't like the fact that I was lied to go there. I joined after 9/11, so like unless that was an inside job, which I'm not making that claim. Yeah, I still would have gone, but the whole Iraq thing was precisely, I think, what stoking Putin for however many years we did. What was it, James Baker, who said not an inch to the east, and then the whole time we'd just been fucking poking him in the eye for 30 plus years. And I don't think that we should have done that, in the same way that I don't think, and those same people were the ones that introduced modern monetary theory and all kinds of other things that got us further along down the pike than we should have.
Well, what do you say to the people who say that? I mean, not that they say, but that when you see the people who are, because you talked about they always, you see a lot written and talking about the people who they look at as the forever war people, right? These John Boltons of the world and people like that. But what do you say to the people who are the granola crunchy anti-war people that are now all gung-ho to go to war?
I don't say much because it won't work. It won't help. I
But
mean,
why do you think, I guess, why do you think all of a sudden that these people who are give peace a chance, singing all the anti-war songs their whole life, now all of a sudden think we got to do any and everything in order to stop the evil Putin, which is funny, harkening back to what Will said earlier when he talked about liking Mitt Romney. Remember Obama joked saying that this is the 80s when he said Russia was a threat. They 80s called, they want their
yeah,
foreign policy
foreign policy
back.
back.
So now the left is frightful of Russia, not China. But beyond that, so now these people who are anti-war seem to want to go to war. Um, and and it's not just our people who are like that. It's fun. And it also kind of brings in the fact, because this is not the main reason, but it made me think of it because I saw what the UK did. It's this weird Trump deranged syndrome. People coined it as a term, and then we realized it was really true. But there's like a new level. I don't know if it has a name left. When you'll do anything scorched earth, including, you know, burning down your own house if you think it'll make Trump, not even hurt Trump, make him look bad. So that's what I thought when I saw the UK after Trump had his argument with Zelensky in the Oval Office, the UK Prime Minister coming out and said, "We'll put boots on the ground if we have to protect you." It's like, really?
Yeah.
Just because, so you're gonna put boots on the ground, you're gonna put young men's lives on the line just to say that you stand with him because of what Trump did. That's a new level of extreme, right?
Oh yeah. Well, the hippy dippies that were against war and now are so gung ho for it have simply changed their position because Rachel Maddow told them to, and they were anti-war because Walter Cronkite took off his glasses and said, when are we going to, whatever his quote was, but like, that's when the turning point after the Tet offensive was a U.S. tactical victory. Harry Reasoner told him, Leslie Stahl told him, Ed Bradley told him, and that's who they've. I mean, the old hippies that I know that were my public school teachers that I see on Facebook have done that about face because they were listening to those anchors, and that was what was solely informing their public opinion.
Wow, that's shocking. Any thoughts on that, Will?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's roughly correct. I don't think most people have deeply formed, intelligent public opinions. I mean, so again, I don't want to get into my whole. I don't think right and wrong are really all that relevant in most situations. I mean, people have heard that if they've listened to more than 3 of these episodes. I do think Putin's the aggressor in the Ukraine war. I mean, if you go back to 2014. Now, actually, again, this gets into like what is right and wrong and over what period of time. I mean, like, have you guys heard Putin's thing on Tucker?
In
Yeah, I don't
in
remember that.
900 AD, there was.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Like it wasn't, and this like people make fun of Tucker as being like very right wing. They imply he's doing a lot of hack work these days. I actually thought this was a good speech by Putin because he was like, you guys come from the Greco-Roman tradition. I come from the Slavic tradition. You have no idea what's going on in this fucking region of the world. And he then launched this thing like I'm making fun of it now, but like when the dreaded Easterners, the yellow men on their swift ponies were finally defeated. Hetman Volodigrad, the Ken Slayer, took power. And it was just like, okay, I get it. And this was Russia. And no, they're the Ukrainians. They were Russia's leg and all this stuff. And so these lands have changed hands dozens of times. But I mean, if you're saying, after 1970, we agreed that these are the boundaries. We're not going to conquer each other anymore. You can say, well, the Jews and the Arabs have been fighting since the Bible, but okay, this latest war was launched by Hamas. There was a peace. Hamas sent fighting men over the border on paragliders. They raped a bunch of people. That's a casus belli. The Jews get to knock them around for 12 months. I mean, you can say that started the war. Obviously. It's the same thing with this here. I mean, obviously, Russia started the war. Russia didn't just begin the war in 2022, actually. I mean, 2014, there was some provocation by Ukraine, but Russia actually invaded with armored units. I mean, took over something like 5% of the country. And I mean, they accelerated that recently. They currently occupy something like 10% of the country. So, I mean, the argument that Ukraine entirely provoked this or that this is some kind of NATO setup, I mean, that doesn't really hold water. But the reason that most people on the American left believe that Ukraine is a freedom fighting, non-corrupt country that in some way is representative of American ideals is entirely because they've been told that. Ukraine, as a political scientist, was long viewed as the most corrupt country in Europe. I have some friends that are seriously working in law enforcement. I teach in criminal justice sometimes. I mean, Ukraine is the source of what are called the Azov movies, or some of the most disgusting child pornography in the game. Ukraine is the source of the Azov Battalion, which is a bunch of literal Nazis. So, I mean, like, this isn't to say the Russians have not done things that are just as bad, but like all this is publicly known for anyone that's in the CJ profession, anyone that's been a soldier, mercenary, anyone that's in the criminal justice field. So the focus on Ukraine, the leader is a coke sniffing 5'6" comedian who has an entire closet full of black sweaters and does not seem to have abandoned his original preferred habits. I mean, like all of this, the transference of that into heroism has been interesting to watch. I mean, again, they're the better party in this war. But I don't post a lot about the Russia-Ukraine war because it's obvious if you just dip over to Telegram for a second. There are a great deal of mutual atrocities on both sides. You kind of want the war to stop so that people have been pulled away from their homes, stop getting killed and tortured. That's my take on it. Ukraine is in the right, but in a lot of these wars, these ancient Slavic blood feuds, and these Middle Eastern kind of conflicts, I mean, there's not really a right so much. It's in 1055, the land belonged to X. In 1066, it was conquered by Y. In 1171, X took it back. In 1218, Y took it back. And I do think that's kind of what we're talking about here, not to give a depressing kind of tone to the proceedings.
Right. Really quickly, did you all see, I'm sure you at least heard of it, if not, and what are your thoughts on the five families coming to DC to talk about, I'm sorry, the five liberal mayors who came to talk about what they did with the immigrants and how they gave them plush places to sleep?
I mean, I guess I'll go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like, I mean, I think the whole thing's ridiculous. So actually, do you like, I assume both of you guys know why that happened, but in general, Tom Holman actually talked about this with the Daily Wire the other day and broke it down in just like really good, simple terms. But if you hold an alien in custody and just have them go to court on the border and you just retain more judges, like you just make magistrate judges from Texas hear these cases and you pay them overtime, make them sleep in the 12-hour days. In general, within 40 days, you hear the case, and the rejection rate for these fake asylum claims was 92%. I didn't know that until Holman told me that, but both W. Bush and Obama just did this. Barack Obama, by the way, generally viewed as like a suave, kind of liberal Democrat.
The deporter in chief.
Yeah, he legitimately, he did not make up those figures. He legitimately deported millions of people, viewed him as competition with Black America. He also killed tens of thousands of people with drones. I kind of like him. First Black president, well done. Anyway, but so But with Obama and with W. Bush, who actually invented this policy, it obviously wasn't a Democratic policy. You just bring judges in there, you make them earn their money, 40 days, the immigrant, the alien goes in front of them, the asylum hearing, they go home. When you release an immigrant or you release an alien from custody, and this is again something just from a legal background you would know, they then go on the out of custody docket. And so you have between 3 years and 9 years before that guy has to go back to court. Now, if that guy gets married and you're talking about, decent looking young Catholic men, like they know if they're citizens, like they don't have to go back, then that person is a citizen. That person has two or more citizen kids. That person is almost never deported. Um, just a solid job. That person is almost never deported. They begin the green card process. So the whole goal was getting these people out there so that they would not be kicked out of the country. And that's why you're doing this stuff, like moving them into large blue cities, putting them in places where the docket is as full as possible. Anyway, the blue city mayors then contributed to this. They were doing stuff like putting them in New York. I think it was the Radisson downtown.
Roosevelt. The Roosevelt.
Roosevelt. Okay, that's it. That's an even better hotel.
Yeah, 5-star hotels. Don't be don't
like
chintz on our migrants, Wilfred.
Yeah, I mean, like they're
only the best.
Staying in hotels I can't afford when I go into New York. Under the Four Seasons,
only the best.
Yeah, but anyway, so like it's crazy stuff. You know what I would do if I was on like a business trip and like Jane came with me and you get a room for like $800 a night, and next door there are like 8 people like in the hall playing cards. Like what's this? But anyway, but anyway, basically, I was aware they came in. I was aware they kind of defended themselves to, big Trump. There's not that much you can say about it, though. Like the red state governors kind of had him over a barrel. They had these sanctuary policies. They were sparring with the red state governors. And so the governor started sending buses to their cities.
Right.
What are they supposed to do? I personally just would have totally amorally sent the buses on,
Right.
I lied.
Keep going. Just tell the bus, keep going. Yeah. Go to the next
like you said you were a sanctuary city. I lied.
Right.
I
that
mean,
would save you millions of dollars. Many,
but I think they just explained their policy and that's it. Some of them are still taking aliens.
But Brooks, the two, you can mention speak about that, but the other layer to that is what I think is brilliant is the lawsuits. Now, I don't know how well they're doing, but the Bondi thing, because you want to talk about the timing of it is interesting, is because if you all recall, Texas sued, no, Texas was trying to defend the border because they asked Biden to do it and he didn't. So they started putting up the wire and doing all the stuff. And then Biden sued them saying that is the federal jurisdiction. You don't get to do that. And then Texas tried to say, but we asked you to do it and you're not. And Texas just basically said, I mean, the federal government said, yes, we are. Releasing them is our way. And they won. That's fine. And everybody was up in arms. But Trump, it looks like, and Holman and Bondi and others are brilliantly saying that if that is the case and that's the precedent and that's what the judge said, then I should be able to haul these people in and say they are circumventing the federal immigration laws by saying they have a sanctuary jurisdiction where federal law doesn't apply. So how can they lose those cases?
Yeah, so I tend to root for mayors and governors against the federal government in general.
Shame, no.
In the spirit of federalism.
Yeah, in theory, right. Not Wu and Brandon Johnson specifically.
Well, but in this case, I mean, the reason I'm for the mayors and the governors is typically because the federal government has overridden its leash in the 18 enumerated powers that it is allowed to in their purview. And it just so happens in this case, the federal government has the like immigration and enforcement of the borders is one of those 18 things. And so, in this case, I certainly think that it's reasonable that they could, prosecute the locals for breaking federal law.
And they don't even need to prosecute them. They just need to make them stop. I mean, everybody, Twitter's always a dump. We should lock them up. Never going to happen. But what they can do is say, starting today, you not only do you sit on your not sit on your hands and get out of the way and run them out the back door and hide them and all that stuff. You hand them over. You participate. You help. And I want you to smile when you do it. I want you to put a smile on your face when you bring me those MS-13 gangsters and help me deport them. I mean, that's about, you can't expect prison or anything. Nobody's putting Brandon Johnson. Brandon Johnson's raising black boys. Did you know that? I know because he
You
tells
can't
us all the
separate
time.
families.
I know because he
Charles,
tells
you
us
can't
all the
separate
time.
families.
You can't
Right.
separate that.
Well, so
Why?
Well,
Why are you a bad man? You know what it's like to raise I'm raising black kids. I'm a black man with a black wife raising black kids. Okay, I just asked
somewhat
why.
unrelated. Yeah. One thing about Brandon Johnson that's almost impressive, actually. Brandon Johnson right now has a 6% approval rating.
That's hard to do.
Yeah. I mean, now I will say the margin of error in the poll he took is 4%, and it's in a positive direction. So it might be less than that.
Me
So I mean,
too.
this is just amazing. Like 2% of people might approve of the job this guy's doing. So I mean, it's like if I were him, I would make myself an all-time legend. I would just get that down to zero. Like there's no reason to stay hard at
Tomorrow,
2%.
I'm arresting all the people. All the
Yeah,
people in the city will be going
just
to jail.
just throw a nun in jail, do what you need to do, get it down to nothing flat. Go to the most popular like Irish bar in Chicago and punch a cop. Do whatever you need to do to get it to zero, become a legend.
Okay, we
Like
run out of time. I got to end on this. I was going to end on, it's been, I think Will said like 50 some odd days. Well, normally I would say, what are your predictions on the next 6 months to the year? But he's moving so fast. What are your predictions on the next 4 days? On the next 2 weeks? Like, what do you see coming down the pipe, both in resistance or from the Trump administration? We'll go with the guests first. Brooks, what do you think?
ah man, potpourri, man. Like it's a toss up. I do think that there's going to be a lot more fights coming. I think the opposition is in its organizing phase now. And so
Mhm.
I think that you will see far more sophisticated and uh, opposition in earnest in the coming weeks start to crop out. One of the things that I hope to see, and if you're familiar with professional wrestling, the one of the classic archetypes is the tag team betrayal, in
Mhm.
which the one tag team member is in the ring, and the his tag team partner decides he's going to switch sides, and he sneaks into the ring with a metal folding chair and hits him over the head, and
Mhm.
and the guy gets pinned, and it's always a tragedy when it occurs. I really hope Linda McMahon takes a folding chair to the Department of Education. Um, we'll
Mhm.
see if that happens, but that would be the thing that I would like to see. I don't know if it will happen or not, but we'll see. I'd love to see the ATF gone. Uh, Cash Patel, the fact that they rolled that under Cash could potentially signal something there. What do you think about that, Will? Do you think that there's something to that rolling ATF under FBI? If my intention was to dismantle that agency and make it go away, I might put it under a larger agency to manage that dismantlement.
enough about ATF to say that. I would say I've always wondered why ATF exists.
Hmm.
I mean, I'm not a cop, but I mean, just even coming from a legal background, I mean, alcohol's legal, tobacco's legal. It's not that heavily regulated interstate anymore. Firearms, you got a lot of regulations, but I mean that definitely falls under FBI as well. I mean, even Texas Rangers, enforce some of those regulations locally. So I don't know why ATF's around. You might correct me on some of that, but yeah, maybe. And that's the sort of thing you could probably get rid of. I mean, a lot of those sub agencies, some of those things that have been around. I mean, Tennessee Valley Authority in this region of the country, there are a lot of things that become almost jokes you could get rid of. That's an interesting point. In terms of the Department of Education, I mean, my understanding is that McMahon said in writing that her goal is to come in and get ready to close things out.
It was like she
So
had a
like
name like Final Mission or something, right?
yeah, it was something cutesy. Like, I mean, she actually, like, she was the power wife of the guy who ran WWE, right? Who himself is going through some things right now, but that's not suitable for a family podcast. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, she said something like final turnkey mission, like she wants to shut it down. I think we'll see what goes on with the Trump administration. I've said this every time I talk about Trump, and I am going to say it again. I agree with Ben Shapiro, obviously the legendary conservative commentator. I prefer kind of teleprompter Trump. there's a lot of support on the right for kind of these wild man antics, just because, like, when we talk about like 65% of upper middle class black women, 42% of upper middle class white women, like, this is everybody's wife to some extent, have these government HR executive jobs. I think there's a lot of kind of like, I have to listen to this at home. I hate it. Give me a bourbon, shut up. Like, there's this reaction to these rules at work. And so when people see like Elon Musk with a chainsaw and Gucci Ray-Bans on and all this, like, there's this sort of male atavistic reaction to it. I actually hate that stuff. Like, if you're arguing with your wife, like, go outside, take a drink. That actually is not the best way to run the government or a large business, that chainsaw Jack Welch kind of approach. So I actually like it when Trump does things like what he did when he came in, when he had 200 executive orders written. They were on a silver tray in front of him. He was able to explain what each one of them did. I'd like to see a little more of that. So hopefully some of the Chris Rufos, Jeremy Carls, Linda McMahons, I mean, all these people, even his own kids. I mean, one of them's running the RNC right now. These very competent people that he's got around him can kind of keep him steered, keep him forward. I mean, he was one of the best negotiators in the world, and kind of get things done. So yeah, I'd love to see ATF go away. Let's hope it happens. I'd love to see DOE close. Let's hope it happens.
Okay. I guess we'll end there, but I do want to say, Brooks, if you're right, I mean, that would be great. My guess, I want to get my take on the ATF thing.
Sure.
My guess would be that is to revamp and weed out deep state. So I don't think it's necessarily to get rid of the functions of it. Be nice, but I don't really think, I mean, we will see, but I don't think that would be the catalyst for it. I would think if it's under Kash Patel and he's cleaning house, that I don't mind it being there kind of mindset, but I want the people who are pulling the levers there to be my guys. And so I think that would be more of the reason why you're doing it.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's been multiple purifications in the agencies. Like in the military, there was a big purge of guys like me who joined after 9/11 to go fight a war and hit a wall of the peacetime types that were like, "Hey, man, don't go making waves. I've got this feather nest that I've put together the last 15 years, and so I'm not interested in being too cavalier." The FBI had this when Mueller was director. They really revamped the promotion policies that favored the DC Beltway types over the hinterland knock around, law enforcement types. COVID certainly did that with the jab. So, essentially undoing those purification processes would be good, but then we just run back into that notion of, well, yeah, but if you leave it on the table, it's just going to end up in the other guy's hands eventually. Not that, through executive order that the next president won't just open it back up for business anyway.
Right. And that's all, again, we started with that and we end with the fact that that's the problem with trying to govern through executive orders. Well, thank you for joining us. It's been great having you. He's Brooks Crenshaw, writer, columnist, speaker, and tell us what your Substack is again.
Yeah, the Substack is called the Daedalus Thread, and you can find me at brookscrenshaw.substack.com. Twitter is @CrenshawActual. Follow me on there.
Yep, follow me on Twitter. Check out the Substack, and it's been great talking to you. Thanks.
You as well. Thanks.
I'm saving the day from you commies who lame. No, you can't fuck with me. I got a country to save. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.